This is the story of a program that started in a converted Coca-Cola bottling plant in Baltimore, paid its first beneficiary $22.54, and today sends nearly $139 billion in checks to 73 million Americans every single month. Social Security turned 90 years old without ever missing a payment, and right now it faces the most serious combination of financial and operational threats in its entire history. What most Americans do not know is where it came from, what it actually is underneath all the politics, and whether it will still be there when they need it. Before August 14, 1935, growing old in America was, for most people, a financial catastrophe waiting to happen. Estimates from that era put the elderly poverty rate somewhere between 70 and 90%, and more than half of all seniors in 1934 lacked sufficient income to support themselves. Only 6 states and territories had old age assistance programs of any kind, and what those programs paid out worked out to roughly 65 cents a day. Of all the elderly Americans who received any state pension at all, the number amounted to about 3% of the senior population, 3%. And that's when the Great Depression arrived and made everything worse. Relief organizations ran on charity and local funds, and they could not come close to meeting the scale of the crisis. Even the states that offered some form of help were cutting their average monthly payments of $19.74 because money was running out for everything at once. The political pressure that followed was enormous. 5 million older Americans joined a nationwide movement organized by a doctor named Francis Townsend, who demanded a $200 monthly pension for every American over 60. Economists called the plan impossible to finance, but the movement sent Washington a clear message. The public wanted something federal, something permanent. Frances Perkins had been thinking about this problem for years before Roosevelt ever asked her to serve. When she met with the president-elect in February 1933 to consider his invitation to join the cabinet as Secretary of Labor, which would make her the first woman ever to hold a cabinet position, she arrived with a list of programs she needed his advance commitment on before she said yes. Old age insurance sat on that list. Roosevelt agreed, and the groundwork for what became Social Security started that afternoon. 14 months after sending Congress a special message promising social insurance as a safeguard against, in his words, the hazards and vicissitudes of life, Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act into law on August 14, 1935. Roosevelt's original vision for the program ran much further than what passed. He told aides he saw no reason why every child, from the day they were born, shouldn't be a member of the Social Security system, cradle to grave, his phrase, for their entire lives. Congress produced something more limited, but the core structure survived. One detail most people miss: the law was not originally called the Social Security Act at all. It started as the Economic Security Act, and the name changed during congressional deliberation. The term Social Security itself had been coined earlier by a man named Abraham Epstein, who ran a group called the American Association for Social Security. But here is the piece of this history that almost never gets told. The original Social Security Act deliberately left out entire categories of workers: agricultural laborers, domestic workers, government employees, and many teachers, nurses, hospital staff, librarians, and social workers. 65% of the African American workforce was excluded from the program from the very first day, along with 27% of white workers. This was not an oversight. Southern Democrats in Congress refused to support the bill without those exclusions. Roosevelt needed their votes, and the compromise stood. Household employees and nonprofit workers were not added until 1950. Hotel workers, laundry workers, agricultural workers, and state and local government employees waited until 1954. And the requirement that all members of Congress pay into Social Security alongside everyone else did not arrive until January 1984, 49 years after Roosevelt signed the original law. Launching Social Security required tracking the lifetime earnings of every working American without a single computer to help. No building in Washington, D.C. was large enough to hold the filing cabinets and paperwork the program required, which is why the Social Security Board moved into a former Coca-Cola bottling plant on the Baltimore waterfront in October 1936. Within 8 days of the program rolling out, over 1 million workers already held Social Security numbers. Payroll taxes were collected starting in January 1937, but no monthly ongoing benefits were paid until January 1940, because the system needed years to build up enough records and reserves to function. The very first monthly check went to a Vermont woman named Ida M. Fuller, delivered on January 31, 1940, for $22.54. Over her entire working life, Fuller had paid a total of $24.75 in Social Security taxes, and then she lived to 100, collecting approximately $22,888 in total benefits. She received back nearly 1,000 times what she had paid in, which made her a favorite example for critics of the program and supporters alike. From that starting point, the program kept growing. Child, spouse, and survivor benefits arrived in 1939. Disability insurance was created in 1956. Medicare came in 1965. Automatic cost of living adjustments were enacted in 1972 and first paid out in 1975. By the mid-1950s, coverage had become near universal for American workers, absorbing the groups that the original law had left behind. What Social Security became over those 90 years is not a niche safety net. It is the financial foundation of American retirement, and the numbers behind it are worth sitting with. 74.5 million Americans collected benefits in 2025, more than 1 in 5 people in this country. Of those recipients, 57.8 million were 65 or older, 11.2 million were disabled and under 65, and the remaining 5.5 million included early retirees and young survivors. About 87% of all Americans aged 65 and over receive Social Security benefits, and for those aged 75 and older, that figure climbs to 93%. The average retired worker collects about $1,900 per month in 2025, though the range varies sharply depending on career earnings. For someone at the low end of lifetime earnings, Social Security replaces about 80% of prior income. For the highest earners, that replacement rate drops to 28%. Roughly 40% of older Americans rely on Social Security for at least half their income, and 15% depend on it entirely. None of that touches the number that matters most, which is this: the program keeps 22 million Americans out of poverty. The collapse in elderly poverty rates, from 35% in 1960 down to 10% by 1995, stands as one of the largest economic shifts in American history, and Social Security drove most of it. Total benefit payments in 2024 ran to $1.47 trillion, administered at a cost of $7.4 billion, which works out to half of 1% of total expenditures. Nearly every dollar collected goes straight out the door as a benefit check. The funding structure that made Social Security work was built around a very different America than the one that exists today. When the program launched in 1945, 42 workers were paying into the system for every single person collecting benefits. By 2035, that ratio is projected to fall to 2.4 workers per beneficiary, and that collapse in the ratio traces back to two things happening at the same time. Average life expectancy at birth now sits at 78.8 years, up from 68 in 1950, which stretched the average retirement from 12 years in 1960 to over 20 years today, meaning each beneficiary draws from the system far longer than the program's architects ever anticipated. And birth rates fell sharply at the same time, with the fertility rate now averaging about 1.6 children per woman, well below the 2.1 needed to replace the population. The result was a wave of demand the payroll base could not keep pace with. 35 million seniors existed in 2000, but by 2025 that number had grown past 63 million. By 2080, 23% of the total U.S. population will be 65 or older, compared to 12% today. Social Security's costs first exceeded its non-interest income back in 2010, and total costs started outrunning total income in 2021. The trust fund, held in special U.S. Treasury bonds, not sitting in a vault somewhere, has been shrinking since, dropping by $67 billion in 2024 alone, down to $2.72 trillion from its 2021 peak of $2.91 trillion. The 2025 Social Security Trustees Report, published in June, sets the official timeline, and the numbers are precise enough to be uncomfortable. The combined trust funds are projected to run dry in 2034, 1 year earlier than the previous report estimated. The retirement-focused fund alone is projected to hit zero in 2033. Measured over 75 years, the actuarial deficit sits at 3.82% of taxable payroll, up from 3.5% the year before, and the present value unfunded obligation through 2099 totals $22.6 trillion. What happens in 2034, though, is not what most people picture when they hear those numbers. An empty trust fund does not mean empty mailboxes. Ongoing payroll tax revenue keeps flowing in, and with that income, Social Security could still pay approximately 81% of scheduled benefits even if Congress did nothing at all. Checks would be reduced, not eliminated, not zeroed out, and that distinction matters enormously to anyone building a retirement plan around this program. The trustees are also careful about the uncertainty in their estimates. A 95% probability band puts depletion somewhere between 2033 and 2039, not at a single fixed point. And those projections were built from assumptions set in December 2024, before the current administration took office, which meant they did not account for new tariff policies, a sharp drop in immigration, or elevated recession risk, all of which analysts say would likely pull the depletion date forward. The United States has navigated this before, and the story of how it happened is more useful than almost any abstract policy argument. By 1981, Social Security was not a decade away from insolvency, it was months away. Estimates at the time put the trust fund running dry as early as August 1983, and plugging the gap through just 1990 required between $150 and $200 billion. Reagan created a bipartisan commission and handed the chair to Alan Greenspan. For over a year, the commission produced nothing. Republicans refused to raise taxes. Democrats refused to slow benefit growth. The two sides arrived at every meeting and left without a deal. That changed when Senators Dole and Moynihan broke away from the full commission and started quiet back-channel talks between Reagan's team and House Speaker Tip O'Neill's team. In January 1983, after a series of private negotiations, the deal took shape. Raise the retirement age from 65 to 67, phased in over decades, delay the cost of living adjustment by 6 months, and require federal employees to pay into Social Security for the first time. Reagan signed the Social Security Amendments of 1983 in April, and standing at the ceremony, he put it this way: "Today, all of us can look each other square in the eye and say, we kept our promises." Greenspan later called the private agreement between Reagan and O'Neill the single most important factor in making the reform possible. That deal bought the program roughly 2 generations of solvency. None of that mattered to George W. Bush in 2005 when he tried to privatize Social Security with Republican majorities in both houses of Congress and failed completely. The political conditions that made 1983 work are genuinely rare, and the current level of polarization in Washington makes them rarer still. While the long-term funding debate plays out over the next decade, a more immediate threat to the program surfaced in 2025 from within the agency itself. The Social Security Administration entered that year with roughly 57,000 employees, already a 50-year low, while serving more beneficiaries than at any point in the program's history. Beginning early in 2025, as part of the Department of Government Efficiency initiative led by Elon Musk, the agency announced plans to cut approximately 7,150 positions, a 13% reduction that would bring total staffing to 50,000. The largest single-year cut in SSA history before that moment was 4,433 employees in 1987. This cut ran more than 60% larger than that previous record, compressed into 6 months. Service degraded fast. Disability application backlogs, already at 1.4 million cases in February, kept climbing. Initial disability decisions averaged 236 days. Appeals averaged 277. Phone hold times stretched to hours, and one regional office found itself covering calls from 2/3 of the state of Indiana because neighboring offices had been eliminated. Some field offices could not pay their own phone bills because a DOGE spending freeze had blocked the use of government credit cards. Former SSA Commissioner Martin O'Malley, who ran the agency under the Biden administration, warned publicly that the cuts would break the program and trigger an interruption of benefits. One SSA employee with 30 years of experience put it plainly to reporters: "No one really knows what they're doing. No one has answers, and at some point, something is going to break." Here is what the record shows as of this research date. No interruption of benefits has occurred. Social Security has not missed a payment in 90 years of operation. O'Malley's predicted timeline did not materialize. But the documented service collapse, real people waiting 9 months for disability decisions on benefits they already earned, is a separate problem from the trust fund question, and it is happening now, not in 2034. None of what is coming is a surprise to anyone who has read the trustees' reports. The math has been public for years. The range of options for closing the funding gap is equally well understood, and none of them are painless. Lifting or eliminating the payroll tax cap would bring in new revenue. In 2025, earnings above $176,100 carry no Social Security tax at all, meaning someone earning $500,000 a year pays the same dollar amount as someone earning $176,000. Raising the payroll tax rate is another option. So is pushing the retirement age higher, reducing benefits for higher income earners through means testing, cutting benefits across the board, allowing a portion of funds to flow into private investment accounts, or expanding immigration to grow the base of workers paying in. Most realistic plans involve some combination of several of those options at once. Every one of them has defenders and opponents. What both major parties have repeatedly refused to do is make any of those choices. Democrats resisting benefit cuts, Republicans resisting tax increases, each side holding the position that made the 1983 crisis nearly impossible to solve before Reagan and O'Neill chose the program over their party platforms. The difference between now and 1983 comes down to timing. When the trust fund was 6 months from collapse, the urgency was undeniable and the room to negotiate was real. With the 2034 deadline still years away, the incentive to act early has not yet overcome the incentive to wait, and the history of this program suggests that waiting is exactly what Congress will continue to do until it cannot. On August 14, 1935, Roosevelt signed a law that changed what it meant to grow old in America. A program that started in a Coca-Cola bottling plant, assembled without computers, built on paper records and payroll deductions, has paid out benefits every single month for 90 years through wars, recessions, a near bankruptcy in 1983, and a pandemic. 74.5 million Americans receive its benefits today. 22 million of them would fall into poverty without it. 87% of Americans over 65 depend on it. And the program now faces, at the same time, a long-term funding gap with a hard deadline of 2034, an operational crisis driven by staffing cuts larger than any in its history, and a political environment with very little sign of the bipartisan agreement that saved it the last time. The math of fixing it is not complicated. Economists across the full political spectrum have published detailed, workable plans for closing the gap. What those plans require is the kind of decision-making that has historically arrived in Washington only when the alternative becomes impossible to ignore. Ida Fuller collected that first check, $22.54, in January 1940 and lived to 100. She could not have imagined what the program would grow into. 74 million Americans are counting on the people responsible for it today to make sure it keeps growing.